Okie dokie, y'all. So, hey, thanks to everybody who is here physically right in the classroom. I count 4 wonderful students, wonderful human beings. And of course, there's you other guys out there, also wonderful human beings. But I hope watching this. I did a last minute switch just because I was worried, y'all, that I might not get to the war in time for the AP test as well as STAR. And there is a lot of STAR that includes very, very specific World War II things. This is a ginormous PowerPoint, over 300 slides. I've tried to cut it down as much as possible for you guys, but it crashed and I ended up some slides in there. So you may see me just fly through some slides and you may see duplicates of some slides. All right, those of you at home should have this. This is basically a STAR outline. This is the basics, but it covers what you need for AP and it covers what you need for STAR. And so what you'll want to do at home, and those of you here can do as well, just kind of follow along, mark some stuff up here as well. Now, what you see on the first page of these things, and I used to, y'all, and I had hundreds of questions on these things, but I'm sparing you guys those questions in hopes that you'll just actually read it. You see the teaks on the very, very first page here, right? They go over what you guys need to know. Definitely read that. But more important, y'all, are the important ideas on the next 2 pages. I'm going to leave it to you guys to read those, highlight them, mark them up. If you're not at this meeting, I'm going to want to see that you guys read it, that you marked it up, that you took notes. That's the only way I will know that you guys actually read it. So if you go and flip over the first page to the second page, you'll see something here that says a return to isolationism. A return to isolationism. Now, a couple of things. Make sure you guys are aware of the dates. You might want to write that down somewhere. World War II in Europe goes from 1939 to 1945. It is important that you know those dates. You can make an argument that the war started earlier if you look at the Asian side of the war, going all the way back to 1931 or 37 with the invasion of Manchuria and China, respectively.
Or 1970, because that's when the actual war, and then like there's 2 years in the war,
yeah.
And Europe knows the Phony War, and then the actual.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly that. So 1941 to 45, we will see the United States in the war, and really it's only December, y'all. So essentially, America, like in World War I, we sit out the first few years of the war. And we are drawn in, and AP and STAR are going to expect you guys to know what our policies were during that time and why we got into the war. So essentially, America's really only in it from early 42 until September 1945. All right, the AP concept, y'all, remember, is one that you guys have had throughout period 7. For the Spanish-American War, you guys have had it for World War I, and you've had it now for World War II. You don't need to necessarily write this down, but remember, America is battling this idea of being isolationistic, right? It's trying to take the advice of our first president and stay out of European wars, trying to stay out of wars that we have nothing to do. But starting with the Spanish-American War in 1898, World War I in 1917 when we get involved, and finally World War II, 1942-ish on, America finally is in its last of these global conflicts. Hopefully it's the last one we'll be in. But each time, y'all, there's going to be debates about it. And at the end of World War II, America is going to make a decision to completely give up that military isolationism. Unlike World War I, where we turned down the League of Nations, we are going to join this new organization and, in fact, become its leader, the United Nations. And also, we will commit just 4 years later in 1949 to joining NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, where we, once again, breaking President Washington's instructions in his farewell address, breaking Jefferson's entangling alliances in his inaugural address. America is going to commit to being in a collective security alliance, a permanent alliance, because we just feel like we can't be in this situation where we stay out of a war, the war gets bigger, and then we get drawn in. And maybe had we intervened sooner, maybe the war wouldn't have got that big. And, you know, AP loves you guys to make those connections across time. And understand that some people today are using that same argument about what Putin is doing in Ukraine. You do have some people saying what's happening in Ukraine now is very much like what happened with Hitler when he went into either the Rhineland or Austria or Czechoslovakia or even Mussolini into Ethiopia. That had the world, had the United States acted to stop that aggression, maybe we could have avoided the terrible conflict of World War II. So you will hear some people using history in that argument. And that's something you guys could use to try to get complexity on your AP test as well, too. Now, there are some dates that you guys need to know for STAR, and it won't hurt you to know for AP as well, too. You might want to write these down somewhere in the margin. They're not necessarily in your AP or in the STAR reader here, but maybe where it says return to isolationism. 1932 is when the war begins in Europe. It begins, y'all, when Hitler and his country, Nazi Germany, that's the political party that controlled it, invades Poland. Britain and France declare war on him, y'all, when he invades Poland. This is where they finally say the aggression's got to stop. So that is generally seen, although somewhat Eurocentrically, as the beginning of the war. As you guys will see, there was fighting going on in Asia and Africa before then. December 7th, obviously a date all Americans need to know. That is, of course, the infamous date, literally the day in infamy, as President Roosevelt called it, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That gets us into the war with the Japanese. And a day or two later, y'all, we declare war, but Germany also, because Germany, y'all, is in an alliance with the Japanese. And problems had been heating up with the Germans anyway. So Hitler, y'all, 2 or 3 days after, I think it was on December 10th, Hitler also declares war on us. And so in mid-December, y'all, by mid-December, we are at war with Germany and with Japan and technically Italy as well, too. So remember, December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day.
War on both sides.
Yeah, and that's going to be the real challenge, of course. Now, June 6, 1944, that's the other date that STAR expects you guys to know, and it wouldn't be bad to know for AP purposes, but not to the same extent. June 6, 1944 is what we call D-Day. The D, y'all, cleverly stands for day, because that was what it was down on the code. They listed it as D-Day. D-Day -1 was the day before, whenever the invasion was going to happen or whatever. This is when the Allies, primarily the United States and Britain and Canada, when we invaded Normandy, France. Normandy is a peninsula in France. We'll look at that. And the purpose was to liberate first France, the Netherlands and Belgium, and finally to go into Germany to get rid of Hitler. Now remember, simultaneously, the Soviet Union is coming from the east and theoretically, although it turned out not to be, liberating the countries of Eastern Europe. And ultimately, we will meet in the kind of southern part of Germany. And this is going to be one of the permanent results of World War II, is leaving the two countries divided. And then finally, the last date you guys need to know, heck, this is more dates than Mr. D had in high school. Well, I mean, that's actually true. But anyway, the war ends in 1945, first in May with what's called VE Day, Victory in Europe. That's May of 1945. Hitler commits suicide, and shortly afterwards, with the fall of Berlin, Germany surrenders. Now, everyone predicted that the war would drag on for much longer, but fortunately, at least as far as most Americans felt at the time, after 2 atomic bombs are dropped on Japan in early August 1945, the Japanese surrender without the United States having to physically invade Japan. Probably saving, at least in my opinion, a lot of American lives, and even with the loss of the 100,000+ Japanese in those 2 cities that were bombed, many historians believe saving Japanese lives, because many of them would have probably fought to the death or been killed in massive bombing raids. So we're kind of surprised when World War II in Japan, in Asia, in the Pacific, ends suddenly with what's called VJ Day in August of 45. The actual surrender isn't until September, as you guys will see. Now, on your own, you guys maybe won't have to write this down. You'll hear about these. But remember, America basically has two presidents during the war. One you should know was our president during the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, known affectionately or unaffectionately as FDR, right, for his middle name of Delano. Now, what he's going to do, much like the man he worked for in World War I when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he is gradually going to get America ready for the war. I think he knew we were going to have to get into this war, but Americans weren't ready physically, psychologically for the war, and so he kind of has to gradually get us going. It doesn't mean I'm a conspiracy buff or anything like some people, but I do believe that he slowly worked us into that. Now, he is president during the recovery during the Great Depression. He takes office in March of 33, and he dies finally in April 1945, just before the war ends in Europe, okay? Now, this is the man that goes before Congress and asks for the declaration of war after the Pearl Harbor attack. Let's see if it plays. This is a date that shall live in infamy.
America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
This is him asking Congress for declaration of war.
Torpedoes were exploded against the sides of the warship.
There we see the attack at Pearl Harbor, okay? And man, you know, I normally would spend weeks on this, but hey, this is what we got. The other president you should be aware of is Harry Truman. Now, he was the vice president only from January of 1945 until he becomes president in April when Roosevelt suddenly died, okay? And he's president throughout the early Cold War, something I hope to be talking about either maybe tomorrow or the next day or whatever, maybe Friday, I don't know. So he's president after Franklin Roosevelt dies. His big decision, one that he is criticized by some historians today for, is that decision to drop the 2 atomic bombs to get Japan to surrender to end the war. He personally said he never had a problem with it. I talked and met the man who dropped the first atomic bomb. He said he never lost any sleep because he believed that he was saving more American lives by dropping it than he was costing in Japanese lives. But we'll look at that, and I'll give you guys some reasons either way in case AP asks you to talk about that. It's still a controversial thing. And remember, he's our president during the early Cold War. Now, AP or STAR expects you to know some specific guys. These guys are listed on your important ideas here, and they're listed throughout the reading. I just went ahead and I put them here at the beginning. All you really need to be able to do is to kind of maybe not recognize the picture. They're not going to do that on AP, obviously. And on STAR, they might ask you what general did such and such. So I know you might feel like this is trivia, but STAR expects you to know it. So make sure you guys know it. You'll find this information in the reading. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, who goes on to be president after Truman, was affectionately known as Ike. He was our general in charge of the whole European theater. He is the guy who planned, or at least is given credit, with planning the D-Day invasion of Normandy. Had it failed, this is the guy that would have had to accept the blame. In fact, he had a speech written, y'all, taking the blame just in case it messed up. Fortunately, it didn't. And of course, later, he is president in between Truman and President Kennedy. Yeah, he was very popular. Okay, this guy is General MacArthur. STAR expects you to know about this guy, and it's also useful for AP more in the context of the Korean War than in World War II.
Drop tactical nuclear bombs.
Okay, now he was in charge of the whole Pacific theater, okay, at least as far as all the land campaigns and some of that. They actually kind of had to divide up the Pacific between him and an admiral that I'm going to mention in just a sec. Now, his strategy that he used in the war was called island hopping. The reason for that was he didn't try to take every single island that the Japanese had invaded. That would have taken years. That would have taken a lot more American and Japanese lives. So he picked strategic islands to take, and then using submarines to cut off any supplies coming there, he tried to starve out those other islands, trying to spare Americans. His most famous moment was when he had promised, after he was kicked out of the Philippines early on in the war, he promised then that he would return to the Philippines. And indeed, and by the way, he had very close connections there. That's where he had worked after he retired from the U.S. Army. Big, long story there. But anyway, he promises to return. And indeed, in 1944, the United States retakes the Philippines from the Japanese. And he comes ashore and he says, "People of the Philippines, I have returned," and lets people know. And in World War, and in Korean War, he will be our general in charge of our forces in Korea at first. But as Zach said, when he disobeys President Truman, when he criticizes the president openly, and when he advocates possibly using nuclear weapons against China, President Truman fires him. And it was a very controversial decision, but it was all based on the idea of civilian leadership over the military, right? Now, a name that Starr especially likes to ask about is Chester Nimitz. Here's a picture of Chester Nimitz, and you'll see a picture of his home here. He was Texan born, or Texas born. This is his hotel that he has. Today it's it's the Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. Now, he was our most famous admiral in World War II in the Pacific, and he and MacArthur, y'all, had to basically divide up the forces. So make sure you're aware of Chester Nimitz and his role there. Yeah, we'll get to him. Now, he is the architect of what's considered the turning point of the Pacific War. That is the June 1942 battle, and we'll talk about it more specifically, in which the United States gets revenge for Pearl Harbor. For the loss of one American aircraft carrier, the Yorktown, the United States sinks 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. And the Japanese, y'all, even though the war drags on for 3 more years, the Japanese Navy never, ever recovers after that victory. And wish I could get more into how he won it, but suffice to know, or suffice, whatever, I never get that word right, he is the victor there. And Texans should be proud, and that's one reason they expect you to know. Now, sorry about this. This is going to be cut off a little bit. Let me get rid of this thing here so you can see a little bit better. Another name that the Star people expect you to know is George Patton. Now, Patton was our most successful division commander in World War II. He was nicknamed Old Blood and Guts because he gave it all. He often led his men from the front. He was our key soldier. This is what AP wants, our Star wants you guys to know. He was our leader during what was called the Battle of the Bulge. Now, towards the end of the war, the Germans, y'all, as we were about to go into Germany, it looked like the war was going to be over by Christmas, that the Germans were folding. But what they were doing is they were holding back a lot of their best equipment, some of their best troops. And under the cover of fog and bad weather, the Germans launch an attack and they drive a big bulge in the Allied line. They were hoping, y'all, to drive all the way to the North Sea and to split the British and American forces and try to prolong this war. Now, we were getting our butt kicked. It was going badly. Patton gets the order to turn his forces around, to drive up and to relieve the American soldiers, to cut off the bulge in the line. And amazingly, in 24 hours, he turns an entire army, y'all, the Third Army around, heads up there and wins this victory. I do have some rare pictures of the Battle of the Bulge here coming up. Let's see. There we go. Mr. D fights that battle every day. That's the Battle of the Bulge. Okay. That was a hard picture to take this morning, you know. Anyway, next. All right, 2 more generals that you need to know. Star expects you to know George Marshall, and he ain't bad to know for the AP test as well, too. He was what we call chief of staff. He was in charge of both armies, working for President Roosevelt and then for President Truman. And also, y'all, after World War II, he will become, this is kind of weird, he goes from being in charge of the generals and the army to being our Secretary of State. And it is Marshall who comes up with and basically convinces Congress to vote for what is known today as the Marshall Plan in his honor. It was a plan to send billions of dollars to Europe, not just the countries that had been our allies, y'all, in World War II, but even Italy and Germany, who had been our enemies. Why? We were fearful, y'all, that those countries, because they were so desperate, they were hurting so bad after World War II, communism was looking very popular. The Communist Party was growing in all those countries. And so the aid, y'all, was all about keeping and convincing those countries to not become communist. And it worked. And the result was they became very good allies. So Marshall is famous for various things. Okay. Another person AP or Star expects you to know, not so much AP, is Omar Bradley, shown right here. 4 stars, okay? Now, Bradley was friends with Patton. Ultimately, he led Patton. They had some real issues and conflicts. But Bradley, y'all, was the man who led the main American army into Normandy. He was our first, general to really lead a large army there. And so he gets a lot of credit for that and was a really good man. I remember when he passed away. He lived, y'all, to be a really, really old guy. So that's some of the trivia that I mean, y'all, is on the STAR test, but not necessarily on the AP test. Now, I'm going to mention a guy later by the name of Vernon Bradley, an African-American hero, kind of like how I mentioned Sergeant York was our hero of World War I. Vernon Bradley is the hero that the STAR test expects you guys to know. All right, some real basics here, and I apologize if this insults anybody.
That last people really teaching French.
Now, the allies that we had in this war, y'all, Great Britain was, one of our allies. Churchill, their leader, until almost the very end of the war, does an amazing job keeping the British people motivated, keeping them fighting, never surrendering, as he said. The French, y'all, sadly, as you'll see, fell very quickly when the war started. They get occupied for most of the war. They even get divided into a pro-Nazi Vichy France in the south. Their group, the Free French, were those who chose to come to Britain or flee to Africa and to fight on our behalf, okay? So they were allies, but I'll be honest, y'all, they did not contribute nearly as much as the British or, of course, the United States. Now, of course, the United States, FDR, Truman are our 2 leaders. And remember, the psycho, Joseph Stalin. Make sure you know Stalin, S-T-A-L-I-N. But I've never understood how a Russian could be Stalin, right? Because they seem to be in a hurry. If they're Russian, why would they be Stalin? Anyway, Stalin was his name de plume or nom de plume, his revolutionary name. His real name was like Joseph Shugashugli or something like that. But anyway, he was known as Stalin. And he'll be the leader he was the leader, y'all, of the Soviet Union from like 1923 after Lenin did the decent thing and died, all the way until he did the decent thing and died in 1953. Or was he murdered, as some people suspect? 30 years in power, right? And so he is Truman's sort of opponent for a lot of the early Cold War, okay? So he's important both in World War II and the Cold War. Stalin, S-T-A-L-I-N. I don't know if it's showing up on there. Looks like it isn't. All right, the Axis. Unlike in World War I, when our enemy was called the Central Powers, in World War II, our enemy is called the Axis. Okay, and by the way, this is a term later, y'all, that President Bush, the second President Bush, the sequel, that he will use to talk about Iran and North Korea and who was his other one? Iraq. He called them an axis of evil. Now, an axis, y'all, is this imaginary thing around which the earth spins, right? And so primarily, in Europe at least, the major axis was Nazi Germany. We call them Nazi Germany, y'all, because that was the political party, the fascist political party represented by Adolf Hitler here. Hitler took as his term Führer, meaning, of course, leader in German. Now, preceded before him was the leader of fascist Italy. In fact, a very influential person on Hitler, the creator of fascism. Later, we'll talk about what fascism is. It was Benito Mussolini, okay, known as Il Duce, right? Also kind of meaning the leader as well, too. And he was the leader and was an ally, but did not contribute. In fact, he was always sort of like an anchor on Hitler, always kind of messing things up for the Germans. Now, the Japanese situation is somewhat more complicated. You have, first of all, this guy whose picture is kind of hidden there. His name was Tojo. He was sort of in charge of the Army and Navy, and he essentially made the decisions. But you've got to remember, Japan also had a king or an emperor named Hirohito. Now, Hirohito, it's very complicated, but in a lot of ways, y'all, he was kind of a combination. It was more like a pope in some ways, kind of like the leader of the people religiously. But, you know, he had to agree to Pearl Harbor or it wouldn't have happened. And he had to be the one to convince the Japanese people to surrender. And so after World War II, when many Americans wanted to see him tried and executed for his role in the war, America chose to keep him. But he did have to renounce that he was a god. And I don't know if you guys have ever had to tell people that you're not a god, but it's hard. It's really hard, okay? And so he became a staunch ally until his death in the 1980s. He lived a very, very long time. Now, I added this one as well because this is going to come up for AP purposes as well as STAR purposes. This man's name was Francisco Franco. Now, Franco became the dictator of Spain following the Spanish Civil War. Now, in the mid to late 30s, Spain had a civil war. Now, that's important both for AP and STAR. Now, he overthrew a pro-leftist, a socialist government called the Republicans. Many of his people were conservatives. They were very pro-religious, and they did not like the leftists. And so he fought a civil war in which he overthrew them and then became dictator. He was technically neutral, but was sympathetic and helped the Germans and the Italians. And he survived World War II. He did not die, y'all, until I was like in 7th or 8th grade. He died in the 1970s. By staying out of the war, he was able to survive. But he's going to play a role. Now, for AP, all right, AP wants you guys to remember that our foreign policy after World War I in the 20s and 30s was generally unilateral, meaning it was our own. We would not join up with any countries. We did invest in other countries, and this is important because remember, for AP, y'all, they like these subtleties. For you just to say America was completely isolationistic is not exactly true. We did invest in a lot of countries. We traded with them. We rewarded countries we liked. We punished countries we didn't like. We made our own peace treaty with Germany. We even made a naval treaty or two with other countries to try to reduce the amount of ships. And in the 20s, y'all, we did intervene in some Latin American and Caribbean countries. So it's not really exactly right to say we were isolationistic. Yes, we did not join the League of Nations. Yes, we did not join any type of alliances, but we did stay involved, but we did not want to be dragged into any wars, right? Like we felt we had been dragged into World War I by bankers and by the so-called merchants of death, the people who sold these weapons. All right, so here you see me saying it, American isolationism. Like I said, qualify that. AP loves it when you mention the exceptions. Americans, y'all, were very focused in the 1920s with their Red Scare. Then we get the Great Depression of the 1930s. And so we're more focused on that. Many Americans, y'all, believe that the two oceans, the Pacific in the West, the Atlantic in the East, would protect us from any type of wars overseas. Remember in the 1920s, we raised tariffs, even, in the 20s and even early 30s, we raised tariffs. We restricted immigration. And remember, one of the key things is, remember, we had loaned lots of money to the French and the British before we entered World War I. Now, of course, once we joined in April 1917, we gave them stuff, like we're giving the Ukraine stuff. Right? We're not expecting Ukraine to pay that back someday, y'all. But in World War I, we did expect France and Britain to pay back. And that's going to lead to some problems, as you will see here in just a sec. So you can say, once again, that's something to talk about with isolationism. Don't worry about this. This is some stuff that was supposed to be knocked out of there. Now, here's 3 exceptions to that isolationism. And I think this is mentioned on your star thing there, and I might have added it. Okay, yeah. Okay, if you look on that first or the second page here under return to isolationism, and like I said, that's being a little too general. We held what was called the Washington Naval Conference in 1921. Now, what the United States did, y'all, was this was a key part of Wilson's 14 points. We wanted to try to cut down, and it didn't save y'all, I corrected the numbers there. And it's not necessarily important to understand, but as far as ships go, only the US and Britain were allowed to have the maximum number of ships because we were 2 ocean navies. So for every 5 ships we had, the British were allowed 5 ships. For every 5 ships we in Britain had, the Japanese were allowed 3. And then I've got that wrong. Italy and France were allowed 1.67. And I don't know if you've ever seen a 1.67 ship. I think it was 1.67. It's pretty sad. Okay. Now, the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Okay. This is another important thing that you could use to show we weren't really isolationistic. Naive, maybe. Kind of stupid. Yeah. But in the 1920s, y'all, while not Harding was president, but while Coolidge was president, the United States and 62 other countries, and that was a majority of the countries, y'all. Africa was not yet the 50 countries that it is today. So there were much fewer countries. Colonization was still going on. So the majority of the countries of the world, y'all, signed this very naive document where they basically said, all of us agree not to have wars anymore. We're going to outlaw war. There's going to be a war holiday. No more war. Woo! Man, boy, did we fix that problem. But of course, y'all, among the countries that signed it were Italy, the Germans, the Japanese, the Soviets, all the people that started World War II, y'all, signed it. The problem is you can sign something that says you're not going to go to war, but how are you ever going to enforce it? And this was a very naive thing. The other thing that we had, and this is definitely something that AP could bring up as well as Kellogg-Briand, but definitely Starr brings it up, is Franklin Roosevelt followed up on what Hoover had started. We had to mend fences with Latin America. Remember, we had invaded a lot of their countries. We'd invaded Mexico on several occasions. We'd intervened when we felt that some of our money and stuff was endangered there. Remember Teddy Roosevelt's corollary, the Monroe Doctrine. the right that only America had the right to intervene in these countries and Europe had to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. FDR is worried about World War II. He's also undergoing the Great Depression. He wants to mend fences. So we promise not to intervene. We promise to be a good neighbor. You know, a good neighbor doesn't go over and attack your neighbor's houses, right? If you disagree with maybe the sign they have in front of their house, you know, maybe they got a Biden sign or a Trump sign and you don't like them, so you go over and attack them or something. You don't do that, right? They're your neighbors. And so the hope, y'all, was to increase trade. So this would help get us out of the depression. Also, we did not want them to support the Axis during World War II. We did not want them to provide bases or maybe even to join. And it was successful, y'all. Very, I mean, not known by most Americans, y'all. Mexico actually declared war on the Germans. Mexico had a flying unit, a group called the Aztec Eagles that flew in World War II. They didn't contribute a whole lot, but they did support us in the war, and so did most of Latin America. So this policy of the good neighbor of Franklin Roosevelt pays off. Here is just the Washington Naval Conference, y'all. I'm just going to fly through some of this stuff. There you see the setup, France and Italy, 1.67. Here you see the Kellogg-Briand Pact. You know, the world literally outlawed. How do you enforce it? And I'm going to skip through some of this. There's the good neighbor policy. Think of State Farm like a good neighbor. FDR is there, okay? And the League of Nations, y'all, bless his heart. The League of Nations, as you can see, is a complete kind of failure here. You know, you guys can read through where it says the rise of dictatorships. It talks about the Russian revolutions, and I'll go over the growth of some of these groups. I've already mentioned Hitler and his Nazis, Mussolini and his fascists, and that. But the failure of the League of Nations. Remember, two of the most important countries, the U.S. and the USSR for a lot of it, y'all, failed to join, weakening it, okay? Now, it very often failed to stop aggressors. That was supposed to be its job, right? To stop what the Austrians had done to Serbia that sparked World War I. So again and again, y'all, the League fails. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. Japan needed lots of resources. It invades. The League does nothing. It tries to criticize them. Nothing happens. And in 1937, Japan goes ahead and invades the rest of China. Once again, nothing really happens. Hitler will occupy, I didn't put the date there, I think it's what, 38? In 1938, Hitler takes over that area between Germany and France along the Rhine River. Also, Franco is fighting this civil war, and the League does nothing to try to stop that civil war successfully. Hitler later invades Austria. He invades all of Czechoslovakia. And finally, you know, we go to war. And when Germany and Japan were criticized for their aggression, they simply kind of shot the finger at the League, y'all, and they essentially walked out. So this great hope of Wilson, y'all, remember he sacrificed everything in Paris or in Versailles to get this League of Nations, which we never joined. It fails. And so we're hoping, and indeed it seems to have done a better job, the United Nations created after World War II. This is one reason, y'all, when North Korea invades South Korea in 1950, that the United Nations feels like we got to do what we didn't do after World War I. We can't let this North Korean guy become the next Hitler or the next, you know, Japanese like Hirohito or Tojo. And so we're going to try to learn from those mistakes. But today, many people are critical about what the United Nations has done or not done to help, for example, Ukraine. So the League, y'all, just never really helps. It never has a large military force. It's left up to the individual countries to disarm and all of that. Here's the other issue. Now, remember, one of the things that we had required, y'all, was that the French and the British repay back the loans. The trouble is they didn't have the money. They had gone broke fighting World War I. And as a result, the French especially, but the British too, insisted the Germans pay reparations. One of the big reasons is they had to pay the money back to us. And so what the deal was, y'all, the French did force the Germans to do, but this is going to lead to a lot of inflation, to a lot of problems in those countries. And eventually, y'all, it's going to help Hitler come to power. I don't want to get into all the details of the Young Plan, the Dawes Plan, but remember, America tried to come up with ways to schedule this. Ultimately, the way it kind of worked, y'all, was like a revolving door. We, the United States, would loan money to Germany. Germany, y'all, would then use that money to pay back the French and British, who would then pay us back for the loans during World War I. We would then take that money and then loan it back to the Germans, who would continue the process. Now, that worked fine until finally the Great Depression, right? And so you see this just kind of crazy system here that was going on, the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, $26 billion, and that. Now, the rise of the dictators. Now, fascism, y'all, both Mussolini and Hitler are generally considered to be fascist, right? I don't know if they mention that on the rise of the dictatorships here, but the idea, y'all, is what's called a totalitarian government. They have complete control over you and me, trying to control even what we think. They completely suppress opposition, all criticism. They control the industry, for example. They control commerce. And of course, oftentimes that's followed by nationalism, wanting to increase their borders. And often, particularly with Hitler, it included racism against the Jewish people. All right, just to kind of skip some stuff here, y'all, in the interest of time. Here you see Mussolini. There's Hirohito. There's Tojo, the real leader. All this was supposed to be cut out of it. This is how bad inflation got in Germany, y'all, as a result of a lot of these payments. Germans literally burned money because it was cheaper than to buy coal or to buy wood. Imagine that. There you see a 1 million mark. No, that's 5. That's a 5 million mark. That might buy you lunch. That's the money, y'all, got so high that they paid you twice a day. You'd get paid, you would spend it at lunchtime, then you'd get paid at the end of the day, and you would spend it before the next day, because the result was going to be so much worse. If you look at this, y'all, in 1914, 4 marks bought you $1. By 1923 here, y'all, it took, what is that, $1 trillion? Is that $1 trillion? Let's see, there's million, there's billion. 4 trillion marks. Trillion, y'all, that's 1,000 billion. 4,000 billion marks bought you a single US dollar. You see like this guy here with his wheelbarrow. He has a stack of money. That might buy him a loaf of bread. And I remember one story, a guy was standing in line and he finally had to go to the bathroom. And so he left his wheelbarrow there with his money. When he came back, y'all, he found his money stacked, but his wheelbarrow was gone. The wheelbarrow was worth more money than all of the money stacked on it. And then check out this young guy. You know who he is? Adolf Hitler, right there, okay? And Germans were made to believe that the Jewish people had caused their problems, that they had stabbed him in the back. Now, real quickly here, y'all, I'm going to show you a video that really kind of explains all of World War II. In fact, I could probably end with this one video here, but of course I won't. So get ready here, y'all.
My teacher? Yes, little Hitler? My desk is small. I need this Polish boy's desk also. Everyone gets the same size desk, little Hitler.
Little Hitler, such a scam.
Now, class. My teacher? I will need the Czechoslovakian boy's desk as well. Little Hitler, where's little Plasky?
Lasky's the Polish kid.
Little Hitler, always having fun.
Well, what's going on here? It's not my problem.
See America?
Now, it's my problem.
Little Hitler,
See, you don't need anything else there. There he is. And you guys know how Hitler tied his shoes, right? And little Nazis. Yeah, I know. You heard it already, but they hadn't. William remembers it. Guess who? Yeah, so there you go. Look at him as a baby. Who would have guessed that he would kill millions or have millions of people killed? All right. So we're going to skip through a lot of this, all this stuff that would go on forever. Okay. So origins of the war, right? Remember we talked about this. I apologize because some of this is from a STAR thing. Some is from my AP thing. So you're going to see some of the stuff in there twice. So what's the deal here, y'all? Germany, y'all, had really felt harshly treated after the war, having to pay these reparations. One problem with the Japanese. Japan, y'all, has an incredibly hardworking, brilliant people. I know that's a stereotype, but trust me, I've been there, and they're hardworking, brilliant people. But one problem is they don't have a lot of raw materials. They don't have a lot of fuel. They didn't have the coal. They didn't have the iron ore. And so, and constantly they were worried about not having enough food to feed their rapidly growing population. And so this is going to be one of the reasons that they first invade China. They had hopes to get India, but also Indochina, what becomes Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, the Dutch East Indies, what is today Indonesia, and why ultimately they went to war with us. Not to get our raw materials or anything, y'all. I don't know if they really had hope of ever coming here, but what they wanted to do was stop us from stopping them. That was the whole idea there. And remember, it is the invasion of Poland that leads to... All right. So among the things, I'm going to fly through this, Manchuria is invaded, but this is important more for AP than for STAR. Now, when Manchuria, which is kind of up above Korea, up there, you know, it's part of China today. When Manchuria was invaded, the United States, not part of the League of Nations, had to decide what to do. Our Secretary of State, his name was Stimson. Stimson announced what has become the Stimson Doctrine, and you want to write this down somewhere. The Stimson Doctrine, y'all, basically the U.S. said, look, we will not recognize any country, any territorial acquisition if it was taken by force, okay? So basically we said, look, we're not going to recognize you. Now, Japan, they kind of see this as double dealing, like, hey, America, you took over territories like, you know, like the Philippines. You took over Puerto Rico, right? You basically control Cuba. What the heck's the difference? Now, the Japanese, y'all, in 1932, before they go to war with China properly, they bombed the heck out of Shanghai. So what did the world do? Well, the Japanese, y'all, they renamed Manchuria and they made it into what's called a puppet state, where they basically controlled it. They even had a pretty cool looking little flag for it. The League of Nations, all it did was pass a resolution that condemned it. And remember, we responded, because remember, we weren't part of the League of Nations. We responded by not recognizing it, because it had been taken by force. What did the Japanese do when they were condemned? They basically gave the finger and they walked out of the League of Nations. So the League of Nations, y'all, failed in its first really big test. Now, the Japanese eventually went ahead and invaded more of Japan. And y'all, the Germans are often remembered justifiably for the horrible things that they did, especially to the Jewish people and to the Russians. But what the Japanese did to the Chinese is absolutely awful. In the town of Nanking, which surrendered after a long siege, the Japanese went on an orgy of violence and rape, literally rape, y'all, raping women as young as 8 or 9, all the way up to 80, y'all. It was just absolutely awful. They tied men together with ropes, machine gunned them, threw gasoline on them, set them on fire to save bullets, and then pushed them in the river to drown, okay? We believe as many as 300,000 Chinese were killed. And, just like you guys are hearing about stuff with the Ukraine, and, fortunately, there's been nothing this bad, Been some terrible stuff, but not on this level, thank God. But you saw Americans begging for us to get involved, but we didn't. Americans did not want a war. That was happening over there to those people. We're okay here, right? And here you see heads. There was actually 2 Japanese soldiers, y'all, that had a beheading competition. They lost track and they had to start over. One ended up winning 106 to 105 heads of people that he had beheaded, okay? And I mean, it was just absolutely awful. Here you even see babies that were dead. They're being stacked there, y'all, for their bodies to be burned. Nasty, nasty. And here you see those 2 guys who had competed, 106 to 105. This was put in the Japanese newspapers. They did some terrible, terrible stuff, okay? And then more of that here. And like I said, some of this is from both things. I mean, it's just awful, y'all. You see them carrying the little baby there. Okay, and more just awful pictures. Now, one thing that could come up on AP but not on STAR, while the United States, was, we weren't completely isolationistic, y'all. We had a gunboat over there in China to kind of look at American interest and everything. And the Japanese in 1937 accidentally attacked our ship, Panay. Now, it had a big American flag flying on it, and it was obvious that it was American. And they ended up sinking it. And the United States complained. The Japanese paid us money for it. But many people, y'all, saw it as sort of a test by the Japanese. Would we do anything? Or would we just turn tail and leave China? So the sinking, the attack on the U.S. gunboat Panay, y'all, was seen as something on it. Now, I've already mentioned the Manchurian crisis here. Now, in the meantime, y'all, Italy was wanting to get territories. Remember, Italy had been kind of left out of the old imperialism scramble for territory. So in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia here, okay? And once again, the League of Nations did very little. They tried to put an embargo on Italy, not sell them stuff, but the one thing they let be sold was the one thing that would have mattered. Italy, y'all, basically has no oil of its own. And the League of Nations could have ground it to a halt, but the League of Nations chose not to include oil. And so ultimately, most of the countries, especially, Germany, accepted this. And sadly, y'all, and this will break your heart if you ever see the video, Haile Selassie, who was the leader of Ethiopia, he appeared before the League of Nations, much like Zelensky appearing before the United Nations, begging that something be done. And he says, like, my country is a small country. Most of you don't even know where my country is, and my country doesn't matter. But today, it's my country. Tomorrow, it will be yours. And walked out of the League of Nations. And the League of Nations had failed another important test. And there's Holly. Germany takes over, that's 36, my bad, takes over the Rhineland. And with that, y'all, Mussolini and Hitler form what they call the Axis. This is where the title comes from. In the meantime, from 36 to 39, Franco is leading a civil war against the elected leftist socialist government of Spain. And the Germans, y'all, choose to help him. Now, the Germans send him lots of planes. They send him lots of tanks. In the meantime, the Soviet Union, which supports the Republican or the leftist government, they send tanks and planes and stuff as well, too. Many people, y'all, hoped that America would intervene against him, that we would make a stand. But once again, y'all, we remembered World War I. We don't want to get dragged into this war. This is a problem for the Spanish people to figure out, not for us. The Germans, by the way, y'all, did test a lot of weapons. Some people see it as a sort of a rehearsal for World War II. Now, this is definitely something to know for AP purposes. Now, just like you guys may remember that some Americans like Hemingway and Seeger, Alan Seeger, and some of those people went over and voluntarily fought for the French against the Germans before we were in the war, including that Estonian guy who fought for the Canadians that came from Czechoslovakia. Just like you have some Americans who are over fighting with, on the side of the Ukrainians. We did have a group of Americans who joined up in what was called the International Brigade. Now, these Americans were members of the Communist Party, and so they chose to go help their fellow socialists and communists against Franco. They were known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, okay? And they were treated pretty poorly. They were used very badly and misused and sacrificed in a lot of ways. To some Americans, they were big heroes. But to others, because they were communists, especially during the Second Red Scare, a lot of them got in trouble and that kind of thing. This would be an example you guys could bring up if you wanted to talk about the time between the wars, if that came up. Now, all during this time, y'all, like I said, some people call it that war. And my stuff's all messed up here, y'all. I had this all correct, and then when it crashed, I lost it. A lot of weapons were practiced and used for the first time in the war, okay? I'm kind of skipping through some stuff here. All right, so then comes the final and worst failure of the League of Nations. Now remember, Europe, especially France, y'all, and to a lesser extent Britain, does not want another world war. That was just a generation ago. They even talked about a lost generation of all these young people. Hitler was threatening a war. They needed to do anything they could to stop him. All right, now, as a result, they are going to give in to him at a place called Munich. Now, I've mentioned all these things before here. I think I have it as a better slide coming up here later. Okay. I can't believe this all got off of there. Okay. Sorry about that, y'all. I don't know why it crashed, but that's just what they do. So this was basically what happened at Munich. Hitler, y'all, was threatening to go to war unless he got what he wanted in Czechoslovakia. What he wanted, y'all, was this area called the Sudetenland, okay? This area right here, where most Germans were. He said, if you give it to me, that's the last thing I will ask for. And so without even letting Czechoslovakia help decide its own fate, y'all, the French, the British, and the Italians got together and they decided, okay, if Hitler will promise us that he won't take anything else, we will give him the Sudetenland. Hitler does take the Sudetenland, but a few months later, y'all, he just goes ahead and he occupies the rest of it. Hungary goes ahead and grabs some territory as well too along the way. And so Hitler has just basically completely ignored them, y'all, as a result of this. And Hitler really believes, y'all, that these people are so fearful of war, they will agree to anything, they will do anything. Now, it's very, very important that you guys know what this term means. It's called appeasement. Now, I don't know if you guys have any little brothers or sisters, but if you do, and let's say you're at the grocery store and you're getting ready to check out, and your little brothers or sisters sees the candy bars or sees the various sweets or the drinks or whatever, and they say, I want. And you're like, or your mom or dad is like, no, man, that's not good for you. You'll be crazy. Like, I want. No, you can't have it. Wah, wah, you're a terrible parent. You're awful. And, you can't beat them anymore, right? Because CPS will come and get you. And so you're like, okay, here's a stupid candy. Hope you get diabetes, kid, and die, And you buy it for him, and you give it to him. What has the kid learned? If I throw a fit, if I act like a jerk, they'll give me what I want. So what does he do next time? Same thing, same effect. You have positively reinforced his bad behavior. That's essentially what appeasement is. You give them something, hoping it will make them happy. But in the long run, y'all, it does nothing but make things much worse. Okay, now, like I said, some of these slides are going to be out of order. One last thing to mention here, and this is useful for AP as well as for STAR. But one of the things some Americans at the time, y'all, that had a problem with, because remember, in World War II, Russia is our ally, but it didn't start that way, y'all. The Soviet Union was very nervous about the Germans, but the Soviet Union, y'all, wanted some territory up here in what's called the Baltics, and they wanted some space between them and the Germans. Now, Stalin, Hitler, y'all, they never trusted anybody their entire lives, except they trusted each other. Okay, maybe it's a dictator thing. I don't know. But what they did, y'all, to everybody's surprise, a lot of people thought, Hitler isn't going to invade Poland, because if he invades Poland, the Soviets ain't going to put up with that. They're going to attack them. And in August 1939, y'all, he announced a treaty, shocked the bejesus out of everybody. You saw all these bejesuses running around afterwards. What they announced, y'all, was that they had agreed to a non-aggression pact. They would not attack each other for 5 years. Well, of course, Hitler breaks that after about 2 years. But what they secretly agreed to, y'all, was that they would attack Poland and they would divide it up between them. Germany would get the West and they would get that. So the thing to remember, y'all, if you're writing about the Cold War and how America had an ally in the Soviet Union during World War II, but after World War II, they become an enemy. Remember this, that they started World War II basically cooperating with Adolf Hitler. The only reason they became our ally is they were attacked by what had been their ally, Hitler. So it was a marriage of convenience that they joined us, y'all. Okay, and we mentioned some of this here. Hitler took over Austria, which is where he'd been born. There you see some of that. Like I said, I took out all these slides earlier, and then here we see the agreement that had been made here. Okay. Okay. Here you see that you agree not to attack each other for 5 years. I love that picture. And of course, we see them together. And check that out. And here we see them on the same sides. If I just had a song, I'm supposed to be playing Reunited and It Feels So Good, but it's not playing there, so whatever. I've mentioned this before, I think in some of the classes, about the Polish corridor that split Germany. This was put on by the League of Nations, or I shouldn't say the League of Nations, the Treaty of Versailles. It literally split, y'all, part of Germany from the rest of Germany. They created the international city of Danzig, and this area, y'all, was given to Poland from Germany. And this is the kind of thing that, of course, Hitler said he would fix. And so after Czechoslovakia, Hitler's next demand, y'all, will be to take the Polish corridor. Now, he really thinks they will back down. Hitler, y'all, has told his generals and admirals he won't be fighting till at least 1943 or 44, because he's going to keep grabbing everything he can, and they're going to do nothing about it. Well, guess what? They did, okay? All right, so the war begins. Hitler invades, the Russians invade. Very quickly, y'all, Poland falls. Now, this is something you need to make sure you write down and are aware of. Let's see what time we got here. Okay, we'll be going about 15 more minutes. Not all I can do, and probably more than you guys can handle. But anyway, y'all, the Germans used, and this is a star thing, a blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg, it means lightning war. It was a new type of warfare. Instead of the big trenches and the big bombardments and everything, the Germans used this new invention, the dive bomber, right? They attacked behind the scenes. They smashed through with their tanks, and that allowed them to occupy really quickly. There you see the word blitzkrieg, all right? And there you see them falling. Now, we'll go ahead and end with this then, y'all, is the French, y'all, had really believed they could win this war by building, or they could stop a war by building this massive line of defense called the Maginot Line. It completely fails. France gets invaded. The French surrender, right? It's embarrassing as can be, y'all. Hitler actually comes and visits Paris and tours it. And the French, but especially, y'all, the British, are forced to take their troops, as many as they can, from a place of Dunkirk. All right, and we'll end with this, y'all. America, or I should say, Britain is left alone. And Britain is going to really test America. Britons, y'all, remember our sympathy, our connections to them going back to our founding, our support of them during World War I. Britain is going to ask for our help. And ultimately, y'all, we're going to help them as much as we can without going to war. Once again, to make that comparison, a lot like what's happening in Ukraine right now, where we're willing to do everything we can, get them the weapons and supplies, get them the training and everything, without American soldiers officially being there and fighting. We don't want war with Russia. We did not want war with the Germans, but we felt like we had to help the British, and we had to help their very charismatic leader, Winston Churchill.
If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
And Britain, y'all, will be bombed like crazy during what was known as the Blitz. The British Air Force, the Royal Air Force that you saw just there, are going to be able to hold out. The Germans bomb daily. They bomb at nighttime. An American reporter over there, covers the story. And he would start off his report with, "This is London." And the British assure us that they can take it. They can handle it. They just need our help to fight the Germans. Now, the reason Hitler was bombing, y'all, was Britain is an island, and he was going to have to use his ships and his planes to be able to get troops there to take it over. He just couldn't go there like he had into France and Belgium and the Netherlands. So he had to get control of the air so that he could knock out the British ships. He could get his troops there to do what he called Operation Sea Lion. The question would be, could the British do it? Could they hold out, or would they fall? This is what is going to do more, y'all, to get the United States into the European war than anything else. And with that, I will go ahead and stop here. Thank y'all for your attention. I'll probably record some more tomorrow and Thursday and get you guys through this massive thing here. All right.